Well, dear colleagues, it is high time for us to begin this seminar. And we have the great delight to have with us this semester Francisco Ramirez from Stanford University. Francisco is professor of education, and you also add, very correctly, by courtesy, of sociology at Stanford University, where he received both his MA and his Ph.D. Before that, he had gotten a BA with magna cum laude at the Salle University in the Philippines. I should mention that at Stanford you have served in many positions, including Associate Dean at the School of Education, and you're also designated as the new director of an institution called SCORE, which is close to the heart of many of us, and which, I hope I decipher it correctly now, Scandinavian Center for Organizational Research at Stanford. And this is an institution that has played a very important role, actually, in research within the social and behavioral sciences in this part of the world. It has quite a long existence, and it's very difficult, it's dangerous to mention names, because then you do injustice to other persons who are not named. But I would say that two of the spiritual fathers, at least, of this institution were a couple of people who have been important to us for us, namely Johan P. Olsen from Norway, who was the leader of, together with Gudmund Hernes, who is actually both a former Stanford visitor in many respects, including having been a fellow of the Center for Advanced Study of Behavioral Science. But Gudmund was also Minister of Education in Norway and is currently, surprisingly and happily enough, the chairman of Salle University. But Johan Olsen and Gudmund Hernes were leading what I still think is the most important social science project in the Scandinavian countries in the past 60, 70 years, namely the Norwegian Commission on Power and Democracy. And in this work, Johan played a very important role promoting what has become something of a major theme, maybe the most important strand of research within large parts of political science and sociology, namely the so-called neo-institutionalist framework, which he elaborated together with a colleague, actually, of yours, Francisco, namely James, or always known as Jim March. And actually, I think Jim March and Johan Olsen were the ones who really created this institution that now Francisco is taking over. But of course, many of you know, certainly, that Stanford has for a very long time been a world-leading center when it comes to organizational research. I mentioned Jim March, but I should have also mentioned perhaps Dick Scott or Woody Powell in this new generation, but also somebody who is, again, very close to you, namely John Mayer, who is an absolutely towering scholar when it comes to studies of, well, the global diffusion of institutional patterns. And in fact, you too have been co-authoring a book dealing with precisely those aspects that was awarded a prize a number of years ago, but in this century, the book which is called Science and the Modern World, and the Modern World Polity, Institutionalization and Globalization. It received the Barrington Moore Honorable Mention Award, and I think you have continued to work closely with John Mayer, who is a very inspiring scholar. He has not been a fellow with us. He was a fellow at the Wissenschaftskolleg, but he certainly visited here and given seminars. I don't know, I have to go on so very much longer, but I should mention that Professor Ramirez has received a number of awards and grants from eminent funding agencies, including the National Science Foundation, the Spencer Foundation, and he has published also, he has a very respectable, not only respectable, outstanding record of academic publications, including most recently a book on comparative institutional forms, dynamics and logic across healthcare and higher education, but also your work on education in world society should be mentioned. And not surprisingly, he has published in the most highly regarded journals in these fields, including Higher Education, American Sociological Review, Social Forces, and a number of others. Well, I mean, maybe I should mention Sociology of Education, Comparative Education Review. But I shouldn't go on. But I'm also happy to say that you contributed to a book which was edited by another two persons close to me and to Uppsala and to the research tradition that you represent, namely your contribution on the rationalization of universities about 10 years ago in a book edited by Marie-Laure Djelic and Sahlin-Andersson, who was my successor as head of the Stockholm Score, which was published by Cambridge. Well, I mean, I think it's very clear that you are one of the absolutely leading scholars when it comes to thinking about globalization, comparison, and historical long-term trajectories of universities. So you're warmly welcome. It's been a sheer delight to have you here.
Thank you very much, Bjorn, for those very kind remarks and for the irresponsibility of inviting me here. I appreciate that, genuinely do. It's a privilege. What I would like to do today is, with your permission, is to do four things. One, I would like to sketch an argument linking society to universities. Secondly, I would like to present some materials that illustrate three aspects of the argument, three features of university that I'm going to be focusing on. Its commitment to development or entrepreneurship, its commitment to inclusion or diversity, and its legalization. Thirdly, I'm going to be presenting a data set that my students and I have been just starting to work on. It compares a national probability sample of universities in the United States with a so-called Ivy League plus sample. And lastly, I'm going to address the question of how much will this model of excellence globalize. Again, the choice of the words organizational actors comes from an essay, not by John Mayer, but by York Crooken and another Mayer. And what they have in mind is the idea that universities increasingly are entities with self-conscious goals, strategies for attaining those goals, and organizational developments that correspond to the goals and the strategies, as opposed to simply being a loose association of masters and scholars. Again, keep in mind the idea of Mussolini that the French university never really had an administrative backbone, as opposed to the American university, which some of us think may have too much of an administrative backbone. Okay, but so I'm going to be dealing with these four different points. So the core of the argument is that there's something about the American cultural matrix that facilitated the earlier rise of a system of higher education in which universities were more entrepreneurial and they were more empowering of individuals, and that those two things add up to the legalization of universities. In my 5 years as malfunctioning as associate dean, I learned one thing. I can summarize those 5 years with one word: lawyers. And in that regard, Stanford seemed to me quite different from my 3-month stay at Oxford, which looked quaint, which looked disorganized, and which really seemed very different. Except I do want to point out that 15 or so years ago, Oxford University, not the college, but Oxford University did end up with a development office. Okay, so I want to point out that a very different medieval university is slowly, some of you might say too slowly, moving in a particular kind of direction. So what is it about the American cultural matrix that I want to emphasize? I want to emphasize three things: optimistic, liberal, and individualistic. Optimistic in the sense that there was a widespread and earlier belief that one could have something called progress, and that was going to be attained not by central planning, not by elite steering, but by the aggregation of individuals pursuing opportunity. And opportunity increasingly got linked to access first to secondary schooling, then to higher education. And the key essay for me there is an essay by Arnold Heidenheimer, in a book called The Development of Welfare States in America and Europe. Okay, and in that particular essay, he compares Germany, Sweden, and the United States. I'm going to put Sweden aside, okay? Sweden is the winner because it's the middle ground, the middle route, okay? But the main thing I want to emphasize is that his contention is that the mantra, the cultural mantra in the United States is opportunity. And the cultural mantra in Germany, we're talking about late 19th, early 20th century developments, was security. So if your mantra is security, you want to make sure you construct a welfare state, and here I'm paraphrasing, so that the lower orders would not aspire to stations beyond their reach. You do not have a welfare state development in the United States at that time that's comparable. And it has nothing to do with politics, because it's the conservative, the autocrat Bismarck who actually puts into play the welfare state in Germany. So we have the mantra is opportunity, easy access to higher education is what fuels that mantra. And higher education is oriented toward markets, not states. And this you can find either if you like Burton Clark's triangle, where the United States is seen as connected to markets, not states, or whether you like Ben David and Zlagzauer's famous paper that no one has read except perhaps Bjorn, because he's read everything, where he in fact distinguishes 4 different educational systems, and the United States is characterized by low levels of state control, low levels of state endorsement, if you will, but also low levels of senior professorial authority. Okay, so it's a very vulnerable enterprise. It's also highly individualistic. Okay, and the most recent effort to try to theorize this or to think about this is David Labarie's book, A Perfect Mess. And that's his shorthand description of early American higher education. From the beginning, you have university leaders hustling for monies. And in a while, I'll show what that means. Hustling for monies, hustling for personnel, deeply embedded in their societies, looking to business and civic leaders, looking to some local government leaders, trying to persuade students to come, trying to persuade their parents to let them to come. All of this is happening at a time when higher education is not all that certain to be successful. And I'm going to pause for a moment and ahead of schedule read one of my favorite quotes, if I can find it here, and that is from Andrew Carnegie. Now, we all know the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Education. It now sits on a hill above Stanford, actually above the Center for the Advanced Studies of Behavioral Sciences. But in 1898, this is what Mr. Carnegie thought of higher education. Men have sent their sons to colleges to waste their energies upon obtaining a knowledge of such languages as Greek and Latin. Pause here for all my European colleagues, which are of no more practical use to them than Choctaw. They have been educated in quotation marks, as if they were destined for life upon some other planet than this. In my own experience, I can say that I have known few young men intended for business who were not injured by a collegiate education. Had they gone into active work during the years spent at college, they would have been better educated men in every sense of that term. Okay, that's 1889. Okay, so there was some earlier skepticism, and you can move into the 60s and 70s, 1960s and 70s, and still see some skepticism. I'll come to that. But it's been a very successful enterprise, the development of higher education in the United States. And I now want to call, and I'll go back to the skepticism in a moment. But for present, what I want is to move on to the second part of the argument. So if all we're talking about is what I just said, it would be an interesting thing, a curiosity. American higher education looks different. American higher education is not involves less state steering. Senior professors have less clout than their counterparts in Germany, for example. They continue to have less clout. But what I want to argue is that a particular model of excellence is being promulgated throughout the world. And that model of excellence, fair or not fair, is rooted in the American university, has as its grounds the American university. So the argument is that universities are changing from historically grounded institutions to organizational actors that are supposed to be more accessible, notions of equity. The days when this could be scoffed at by a number of intellectuals gets harder and harder. More entrepreneurial, more empowering of individuals, and more professionalized. And I will zero in on legalization, but I'm really talking about the professionalization of administrative staff in general. These changes reflect the degree to which universities are influenced by an idealized model university, and that is dramatized by, quote, world-class metaphors and transnational organizations, rankings from Shanghai to the Times Higher Education. It's disseminated by consultants, really consultants without borders. We like those doctors without borders. We're not that keen on consultants without borders when it comes to higher education. Did anyone say McKinsey? Okay, so well, everyone knows what I'm talking about. And they're always portrayed as portable practices. That's important because if they were portrayed as American university, it would be easier to block it. But it's always portrayed as an abstract, portable practice. What we want is a university that's more entrepreneurial, Burton Clark's book, which never actually points to American universities, although it's pretty clear that that's what he has in mind. What we have in what's argued is that in a learning society, you want universities that help students learn to learn. We want a more student-centered university, making sure that they actually learn something, not just that they're being lectured to. So many of these ideas are presented in very abstract ways and as ideas that are portable. Okay? And that's what makes it a little more difficult to block them. If I have time, I'll conclude with what the University of Warwick now presents itself to be. Okay. This simply is a description of the world, and it's the world as regards post-secondary enrollments and the expansion of universities. You can see that there's a big jump. I mean, one way of putting this is there have been more universities created after World War II than in the history of humankind before World War II. To be sure, some of these universities are not born out of scratch. Some of these universities are the rebranding of agricultural colleges, technical colleges, nursing colleges, teacher ed colleges, polytechnics of various kinds, but they all at the end up with the name university. And the interesting thing is that some of these more sort of practical universities, if you will, applied science universities, came earlier in the United States with the Land Grant Acts, the Merrill Acts, 1870-ish and then 1890-ish. And those were universities that were created with a very explicit goal. We want to upgrade the quality of agriculture and manufacturing, and we think this is going to happen through the university. Now, if you look at the curriculum of these universities in the 19th century, they're teaching Latin too. They're teaching history too. But they're also teaching subjects that in other countries were thought of as not university proper. And there was a time back in the 1980s when I could look at a German colleague and he would tell me, but Chiki, is MIT really a university? They don't have a law school. They don't have a medical school. I haven't heard that in a very long time. Because MIT makes it into those rankings. It makes it into the top 5 rather consistently. And German universities are not there, fair or not fair. Okay, but so I don't get the same kind of interesting remark that suggested that there was something essential called a university and that you could point to criteria and say that's not really a university. Okay? Enrollments have also gone up almost in a linear fashion. I mean, I'm sorry, not linear. There's a big spike. Again, all of this in a kind of post-World War II world. This is dated. It ends around 1990. Okay, but the growth is really quite spectacular. In a paper, I point out that Botswana got to where it got as far as enrollments in 2000, and that was the level of enrollments in the UK by 1960. Okay. So again, I'm not saying they were of the same quality, but I'm just saying the commitment to higher education has a global character. A second kind of thing to remember is that we're now in the world in which there's a lot of chat about world-class universities, okay? And again, everyone is skeptical about it, so am I, but this was an attempt on my part to look at European journals and see the extent to which they would actually make a reference to world-class universities. And again, it's a very slow development, but you do see a spike in the middle of the 21st century. So that's just context. Okay. The Entrepreneurial University. We now associate the Entrepreneurial University, those of us in this particular way of thinking, with Burton Clark's book. And what does he have in mind? He has in mind university industry projects. He has in mind cooperation between businesses and universities. He has in mind Silicon Valley, okay? But much earlier, what we have is universities trying to secure funding. Harvard, before even the United States becomes an independent country, sends people back to England to try to secure funding for this fledgling college, okay? Remember, this is founded not by a philanthropist, not by a man of business, but by a man of the cloth, okay? So they're struggling. And Benjamin Franklin, writing in the 19th century, has a guideline for how to do this. You know, how do we fundraise? Now, you might say patronage is a very old thing. Medieval universities had patronage from popes, they had patronage from emperors, they had patronage from kings. But what we're talking about here, I want to argue, is not simply the patronage for creating a building, for upgrading a library, for upgrading a laboratory. The crucial word here is permanent. The crucial thing here is to have permanent funds, which we now call endowments. And at the time Charles Eliot said these words, Harvard was behind. Harvard did not have the same endowment as Cornell or Stanford or Vanderbilt, because these other institutions were founded by very wealthy people. So their initial endowment was by far greater than Harvard's. Harvard was playing catch-up. By 1920, it led, and it has never been behind since. This was conscious, agentic effort on the part of Mr. Eliot, who also in the late 19th century blocked an effort to create a national university. It was a second dream of a national university. The earlier one was Thomas Jefferson with the University of Virginia that no one imagines is a national university. But there was a second effort in the late 19th century. And again, those are not his exact words, but paraphrasing what Mr. Eliot said was, the federal government should not be in the business of choosing winners and losers. A very kind of American imagery, okay? Keep the federal government away. I also want to call your attention to the fact that he's imagining a competitive world. Not just competing between American universities, but in 1906, he has the nerve to imagine competing with foreign universities. Imagine if the Shanghai ratings had taken place in 1906. No American university would have made the top 10. Not a single one. But he's already imagining a competitive world, in part because he is in a competitive landscape. Okay, these universities and colleges are competing with one another. The University of Chicago is founded by mercilessly raiding Clark University. So we hear of the University of Chicago now, we hear less of Clark University. Stanford went out of its way to attract Ivy League professors by pointing to the sun. You can be practicing your tennis strokes in January. You will have no snow to plow for the rest of your life. Okay. It still does that. I mean, Stanford actually has funds for raiding universities and for protecting itself from raiding. Raiding is an American expression. It may have Viking roots, but it is an American expression. What I give you here is the words of Chiang Kai Ming, and he was the vice provost of the University of Hong Kong. And if you read those words, the spirit is very much in the American spirit. The notion of institutional advancement, that's development, that's securing funds to develop, has a liberating function. And it has a very cheerful and optimistic, upbeat tone. Now, of course, Chiang Kai Ming got his EDD from Harvard, so maybe that partly explains it. But all I want to make is the point that this idea of committing oneself to development, of trying to secure funding, And again, I forgot earlier to point out the key paper is by Kimball, and it's in the History of Education Quarterly. By now, I think you should know I'm not a historian, okay? I simply lean on historians. And he's the one who really that describes the earlier effort on the part of Harvard to go into development. This is an example of what a development office looks like. No, this is not the entire organizational flowchart of the University of Michigan. This is simply the flowchart of the Office of Development. It has 54 boxes. I say that so you don't think it's important to count them. But it has 54 boxes, 54 offices, if you will, all leading up to the Vice President for Development. The University of Michigan is a state university, now calls itself a state-assisted university because the funding for it from the state is roughly 15%. And my colleagues there say it should be rebranded as a state-molested university because the regulations are there, but the funding is not. One of the points I want to make is that the distinction between public and private, which is so sacred in the European imaginary, is very weak in the United States. True, you will find that earlier on, development offices were created in private universities that did not have federal state funding, but over time they completely merged. Or as I say in an unpublished paper, Berkeley has BP, British Petroleum, Stanford has Exxon. Public university, private university, but funding coming from different sources to build what was then called the School of Earth Sciences. I think it has a fancier name now. I suggested Earth, Wind, and Fire for Stanford, but some older people remembered that was the name of a band and decided they didn't want to do that. Okay, this is simply to illustrate the centrality of the development office. The Council for Advancement and Support of Education is rather crucial because it stems from a 1958 conference. Conference was sponsored by the Ford Foundation, which will be playing a role in many of these developments. And the outcome of the conference was the Breyer Report. And the central recommendation of that report was that every university president should have an assistant whose task it is to engage in fundraising. That was the central conclusion. And out of that, two different associations ended up with the Council for Advancement and Support of Education. It's a serious enterprise. The Vice Provost for Development at Stanford sits in its Board of Trustees, the same Vice Provost who in my interview with him tells me that fundraising is a full contact sport. Competitive. Over 3,000 members. I have 77, but I've been corrected. It's now over 80. And the list of universities, it has regional offices in London, Singapore, Mexico City, New York, and Washington. And it has one goal, which is to teach universities how to professionalize fundraising. Okay? And that means that this will not be done in a haphazard way. Yes, you may still get phone calls from some sweet undergraduate wanting to pick your pocket, but you will also have a very professionalized fundraising. And the important thing to keep in mind, to go back to Elliot, this is an ongoing activity. This is not a one-shot thing. What you want is a lake of wealth, and you want rivers of revenue consistently entering into that lake. Okay? So you have a 5-year fundraising campaign, but when that ends, you have another one. You never say, it's over. Okay? That is in the American context. You never do that. And this is a council that provides that kind of advice. Okay? I repeat, you can also, if you go through their website, see which kinds of colleges and universities they've had contacts with. So as you might imagine, you have business schools, you have institutes of technology, but you also have several colleges from Oxford and Cambridge that have had contacts with Case. So it's not a minor actor, and one of my students is actually interviewing people there as part of her doctoral dissertation. One of the things I want to do before I get there is to remind people that it's not just universities creating development offices looking at one another. There are consultants that teach you how to do development, and there's association of development officers, okay? So I want to push the idea that we're talking about an organizational field where you have different kinds of actors in interaction with one another around these sort of common goals. I suggested that we have not just the Entrepreneurial University as a feature of American higher education, now being sold to the rest of the world as an important kind of thing to do, but we also have in American higher education an earlier commitment to empowering individuals. For much of its history, individuals were men. Women came in shortly thereafter, and for much of its history, individuals did not include people of color. That, of course, has changed in the last decades. So here we have one. I'm only going to show two slides. One slide, and this is the president of Swarthmore, which is a very distinguished liberal arts college, actually part of the elite plus, the Ivy plus. And it basically talks about the importance of diversity. More interesting to me is Providence College, which is not an elite institution. And there's a reason why Joelle is laughing, and she'll laugh even further in a moment. This is a Dominican college, okay? The Dominicans are the order of preachers. The order of preachers played a significant role in that historical event that we sometimes call the Inquisition. But do note their statement here. They are talking about the importance of diversity is a key component of our collective pursuit of truth. A key component of the collective pursuit of truth is diversity, okay? So even within a small, relatively unknown Catholic Dominican college, the diversity mantra enters into play. The next slide is designed to illustrate that we're not simply talking about do not discriminate, okay? We're talking about the attempt to think through diversity as a means to excellence. And here again, the Ford Foundation, which always shows up on many of these developments, plays a role, and it provides a grant in October 2003, and I think this is the American Association of Colleges and Universities. But what is it trying to do? It's trying to support work to understand and then demonstrate how campuses can coherently and comprehensively link their diversity, inclusion, and equity. Those are the three words that are often used interchangeably, just like development is used interchangeably with institutional advancement. To link them to their central work of achieving academic excellence. So this is not simply about do not discriminate. In this new way of thinking, diversity is seen as a means to an end, and you have not simply different universities moving in this direction, you have a broader framework. And yes, there's also an association of diversity officers in higher education. I want to hammer that point, that you create these different kinds of associations. And if you don't know how to do diversity, you have thousands and thousands of opportunities to do so. I literally get once a week something along these lines, either about diversity or development or students. My favorite one, which I didn't show here, is the one that talks about your obligations to accommodate students who need service animals when they take exams. You know, they may be anxious, and basically says you should accommodate that, okay? I've sort of wondered about what happens if they show up with Doberman and they create anxieties in me. So my daughter has suggested that we should have a puppies and Pinot night, okay? Puppies for those who need the dogs, and Pinots for those of us who need to overcome those fears as well. But again, is your institution making a concerted effort to recruit, hire, and retain diversity faculty? Okay, so there are websites like there are webinars like this, there are workshops like this. So again, part of the landscape is all these efforts to teach you how to do diversity, to teach you how to raise funds. Okay? This is a very kind of American landscape. I suggested that the rise of the Entrepreneurial University and the empowering of individuals would lead to legalization. Again, the empowering of individuals here does not mean empowering students as a status group. We're not here talking about the Cordoba University model, where students really do play a role in the tripartite governance of the university. We're talking about the empowerment of students, the empowerment of faculty as individuals, individual rights, okay? And so that manifests itself in two ways that I think actually lead to legalization. On the one hand, the right to pursue enterprise. So professors in med schools imagine that they'll come up with some particular product that will have commercial value. And professors in engineering think likewise. And professors even in the arts and sciences imagine themselves as entrepreneurial. And the more you imagine yourself as entrepreneurial, the more you are dealing with various kinds of stakeholders, the greater the likelihood that you'll have conflicts of interest, okay? And that's a phenomena that was not exactly part of an older university, but is increasingly a part of the contemporary university. So once every 2 years, I have to fill out a form on conflicts of interest, which is very embarrassing because I realize I don't really fit what they have in mind, okay? But if I was a professor in a med school, sitting on the board of Lilly Pharmaceuticals, I could see why I would have to fill out a conflict of interest form. So that's one. The other has to do with all other kinds of rights, which is, and they often come into clash. The professor has the right to determine when the exams will take place and how many hours, but the professor is often faced with the disability rights and the obligation to accommodate the disabled, either giving them a longer period of time or presenting the exam in different formats. And you get more and more of this, okay? The last thing I want to say before legalization is, in some universities, the tenure rate is over 95%. That doesn't mean you won't be scared, but it is at over 95%. I know I taught at San Francisco State University for many years. In other universities, the tenure rate is 40 to 50%, and that means that a lot of people are not going to get tenured. And in the old days, what that meant is that you were angry, or you were sad, or you were depressed. Today, it means you fall in love with a lawyer, or at least with the ombudsperson, okay? And it is a recurring feature of contemporary universities that they know that all of this is going to require paying attention to the process, trying to specify more clearly tenure criteria, trying to specify the process. And at the end of the day, that leads to what I'm talking about here, which is the more legalized university. Okay, this is from the University of Minnesota. General Counsel ensure that the best possible litigation outcomes, again, you're already imagining that there's going to be litigation, okay? And minimize legal problems by offering proactive legal services. These services are from academic misconduct to conflicts of interest, to human and animal research regulation, to employment, and to patents. All those exciting social psych experiments of the 1960s are verboten, okay, because they could inflict harm on subjects, because subjects were in many ways deceived. There are elaborate human subjects committees constructed in order to make sure that none of these things are problematic. I know I chaired it for 2 years. So again, this is a very intense effort, and it puts lawyers more and more at the center. If you have to write a letter to explain to someone why they're not getting tenure, why the school is not recommending for tenure, legal office wants to vet this. They don't want, Ramirez to be flippant, and believe me, Ramirez is not flippant in that role. But they literally read all the letters from the outside, and they have comments about, well, how serious is this endorsement? How weak is it? Remember, these are not lawyers who have expertise in sociology or education or philosophy or electrical engineering, okay? But they nonetheless are playing a pivotal role in shaping the document. Because what are they concerned about? They're concerned about possible litigation. Okay? It also means that all your email is now more problematic. In my interview with a Stanford lawyer, who I knew when we were both kids, I was going to say, meaning in our 40s, he told me, you know what email stands for? And I paused. I'm not a computer science guy, and I'm not. What does E in front of email stand for? He said it means evidentiary. That's what the E in front of email stands for. Evidentiary mail. Don't tell me that you trashed your email. It's there. Okay. So extraordinary amount of caution exercised on all kinds of matters. And yes, there is a National Association of Lawyers and Legal Workshops. You can look at their websites. They deal with all kinds of issues. It has more than 1,000 campuses. The reason why you have more campuses than institutions is because they think of a State University of New York as the overall institution, but it has several campuses. The University of California system is the same thing. But that's a very large number of entities connected to the National Association of Lawyers and Legal Workshops. Okay, so this is an ongoing process. It's fairly new, but it's developing. You will look at some websites where a university legal counsel will proudly note that it's a member of this. So it communicates sobriety. This is Dartmouth, and if you know anything about Dartmouth, man, they do need general counsel. How many here have seen the movie Animal House? You don't have to be embarrassed, okay? Okay, that's based on Dartmouth, okay? And that should tell you why they need. But again, you can see what's nice here is they actually identify some of the concerns, some of the dimensions: affirmative action and non-discrimination, athletics, environmental law, intellectual property, technology transfer at the end. But those are about 20-some items, okay, that legal office is dealing with. In the late 1990s, legal office at Stanford was 8 people. It's now 35 and counting, okay? And one of my tasks as associate dean was to meet once a year with legal counsel. And so after decades of never having dealt with a university lawyer, I almost got intimate in terms of, getting to know them, okay? Okay, so up to this point, I've made an argument. The argument is that American higher education emerges in a very competitive environment. It's oriented towards seeking funds. It becomes entrepreneurial very early on. And that it's also very much empowering individuals within them. And that those two things lead to the legalization. And that this model is now presented as a model of excellence. Think of all the magic words we use. Universities should be more accountable, should be more transparent, should be more engaged with the community. Okay, many of these things happen earlier in the United States. Okay, as I think I've said to some of you, I've never understood the European obsession with new public management until I realized the reason you don't understand this is because it was not so new in the United States. We've had administration in the United States for a very long time, and I squirm when I hear my colleagues talk about the president as first among equals. First among equals? Are you kidding me? The university president is not first among equals. Not even a lecturer believes that, okay? So it's a very different, it's a system I got used to, which is now in some ways being imposed on European universities with very different traditions. Okay, so what I want to do is sort of briefly go through an attempt to investigate some of these more systematically. What you're looking at here now is a national probability sample. The IPED stands for Integrated Post-Secondary Educational Statistics. And what we've done is to do a 2-stage sampling by region and then by whether they're public or private. And from that, we end up with 1,250 universities. And I use the word university in the American sense, which would include universities and colleges. We eliminate the for-profits. University of Phoenix is not here, for example, even though it is the largest university in the United States. And we eliminate 2-year colleges. They're not included here. And we also eliminate those that have less than 1,000 students. Okay, that yields 1,250. And we went for a 20% random sample, end up with 238, which is a little less than 20%. So that's our national probability sample. And we're going to be comparing that with something called the Ivy League Plus. Now, the Ivy League Plus is a category, but it's not a vacuous category. How do I know it's not vacuous? Because the provosts of some of these institutions actually meet annually, okay? And they meet annually to discuss important issues. For example, how to collude on the pricing of the universities. Okay, they don't say that, but they do meet annually. The chief counsels, the chief legal counsels, also meet annually. So I wanted to compare these two things on the premise that they may look different, And my main point is to compare them with the following question. Do they have a development office? Do they have again, development or institutional advancement? Do they have a diversity office? Do they have a legal office? Do they have a senior legal officer, a senior, okay? So very briefly, I'll show you what's going on here. On the question of development office, you can see that if you look at the national sample, it's like 99% have a development office. It has gotten to the point where one can say, if university, then development office. Okay, I'm sort of channeling my inner logician. If university, then development office. And that's a very high level of institutionalization. Okay, it's 100% with respect to the Ivy Plus sample. But they're very similar. Senior development officer, 88% of the national probability sample have a senior development officer. Senior means they're either vice president or vice provost. In other words, it's not just a minor legal assistant. Okay. Now, where they do differ, and that should be obvious, is on the size of their office. Okay. So the mean development office size for the national sample is about 28, and for the Ivy Plus, it's 120. More resource-rich universities are more likely to have larger development offices. Okay, but it's now a standard feature of American higher education. It's less institutionalized, but we know by looking at earlier data that there were less of these. So what we're now looking at diversity offices, and it's about 60% have them. And again, if you look at the Ivy Plus, it's 96%. Okay, the mean here is what I'm looking at. Okay, and I'm not going to go through every number here because my task is not to put you all to sleep. Okay, but the point I want to make is that it's not quite as institutionalized as the development office, but those are still fairly high numbers in comparison to what these looked like some decades ago. So it's increasing. Here we have legal offices, and it's about 50% for the sample as a whole, and it's about 93% for the Ivy League Plus. So with respect to the Ivy League Plus, all of these three things are highly institutionalized. They're really taken for granted. You got to have a development office, you got to have a diversity office, and you got to have a legal office. And for the most part, you have to have a senior legal officer in all of these three things. Okay. Okay. Question that then arises is, will this globalize? And here I fall back on Scandinavian institutionalists who have invented the idea, a very sensible idea, of translation or editing. What they're saying is some of these features are not going to be transported from one terrain to another in total. They're going to be translated. And the answer is, of course they're going to be translated. But just as every translation of Weber differs, and we have experts here who will tell you which are the better translations, but no one reading any of these translations, even Parsons' translation, will say, I'm reading Durkheim, or I'm reading the Bible. Everyone will know they're reading some version of Weber. Okay? So yes, there are translations, but in fact, they're more closely to each other than if we had completely different kinds of books, in this case, completely different systems. So in looking at development offices, I've already suggested to you that there is a rise of development offices in different parts of the world. There's more resistance in Europe than in Asia. Asia is all in terms of moving in this direction, in part because it's all in terms of trying to create, quote, outstanding universities. It doesn't have a historical legacy that in some ways gets in the way of moving in this direction, gets in the way or purifies it. With respect to diversity offices, there's a paper by Simon Ortel looking at the rise and diffusion of diversity offices in Germany. And the interesting thing is that the newer ones are more likely to have them. And it kind of makes sense. It's an old organizational idea having to do with organizational age, and which suggests that the newer ones are more likely to innovate. They have less tradition to try to overcome. And I said until a week ago that these diversity offices were primarily about women, but Barbara Kemp corrected me literally 4 or 5 days ago and said, you know, they're actually now expanding the scope of what it means to do diversity in German universities. We cannot use the word race, that's verboten, but we do talk about first generation students, which is a kind of social class imagery. So that's happening too, which is very interesting to me. Is legalization going to happen? Now, in one sense, you could talk about all universities have legal standing in the sense that there's some legal statutes that create them. They have to be in compliance with some state directives, okay? But legalization in the sense that I'm talking about, arising out of the involvement with the environment in terms of entrepreneurship, or legalization with respect to clashes of rights, that I don't know whether it's going to happen. And it is kind of an interesting question. One short example, one short anecdote. South Korea, an assistant professor forces himself, kisses a student in a bar, and gets fired. I talked to 3 different colleagues in 3 different Korean universities. They're all Stanford graduates. They all tell the same story. So I assume that this is not an urban myth, that somebody really did get fired. So I asked them the American question. So what was the process that led to his being fired? And they kind of look at me and they go, no, Cheeky, there was no process. He just got fired, you know. And I realized conceptions of due process, which are very American and which often get universities very bad headlines, are not developed. So they have embraced the idea that sexual harassment is bad. Okay, that has emerged in both. It has emerged in both Korea and in Israel and in many different parts. Okay. And in the Korean response is simply to axe the person, but without any of the legalization that would take place in an American university. So that may well be happening. Okay. So how do we propose to address this? There are 2 little research directions that I want to move on. One is national. I want to go back and find out what are the founding dates of this development, this diversity, and this legalization offices. Because if I have the founding dates, then I can actually do a kind of statistical analysis with the question, when is a university at risk of having its first development office, its first diversity office? Look, I'm an American sociologist. American sociologists learn how to torture data. That's called data analysis. So that I would like to be able to do that. But I have a second, more comparative kind of interest, and it is to look at European universities. And I have a colleague, David Frank, who has an international data set, very briefly described here. It's not it involves no probability sampling. It simply has 2 universities per country, and it generates this data set. And the one virtue is he has data on them over a long period of time. Now, his focus is the changing composition of faculty in these universities over time. My focus would be on when they start creating these kinds of offices, when they begin to look more and more like American universities, or alternatively, when they resist this. So I want to conclude, and this is in honor of one of my colleagues here, I want to conclude with March 2015, Warwick tone of voice. Now, the idea that a university has to have a tone of voice is already very much an organizational actor. I mean, if you think about the Catholic Church or the Lutheran Church in some earlier incantation, they wouldn't be talking about a tone of voice. You knew what it was. Okay? In the words of Jim March, Don Quixote is Don Quixote because sé quien soy. I know who I am. I don't have to reflect on it and project to you who I am. I don't have to advertise who I am. I don't have to have a communications office. But in a world where this begins to shift, universities begin to project who they are. So, very briefly, what is tone of voice and why do we need a Warwick tone of voice? The tone of our language defines the way people respond to us. Notice, people don't know how to respond to us. We have to cultivate that. By writing in a tone that's true to our brand, we can express what it is that makes University of Warwick unique. Now, I season the word unique because there's a tension in all of this. On the one hand, you get legitimacy out of being a university. So even entities that look very weak resource poor. They struggle to project the idea we are a university because you derive some legitimacy from being part of the category. And I would argue that's true with respect to being a nation state, which is why we have flags and national anthems and other kinds of things that symbolize a nation state, even among really weak and failed nation states. And that's true also with respect to persons. We're perennially projecting ourselves. So you get some legitimacy out of fitting the category, but you also want to be able to distinguish yourself. You cannot just say, like me, I'm a nice person. Okay, you want to have something that distinguishes you, hence the point of uniqueness. But when you see what makes them unique, you'll realize how difficult it is to, quote, be unique. What is it that makes us unique? We're a university with modern values and a formidable record of academic and commercial achievement. Notice commercial achievement is there from the start. I understand this was created as a business university, hence critiqued by E.P. Thompson, among others, but not the only one. So what sets us apart? It's important to try to set you apart, okay? The difference lies in our approach to everything we do. Warwick is a place that fundamentally rejects the notion of obstacles, which is about as American as apple pie. This could be Florida State. This could be Ohio State. A place where the starting point is always anything is possible. I mean, I kind of wonder, who were the consultants here? This can best be communicated using the language of what could be and a phrase, what if. So it turns out that part of the branding of Warwick is what if. So I will conclude with that and opening up to questions, and I thank you for your attention.